I had a habit, years back, of what scholars call a Johannine audit. It sounds more formal than it is. You sit down with a Greek New Testament, a concordance, and a legal pad, and you do something very simple. You track every occurrence of a name across all four Gospels. It takes a few hours. It is not glamorous work, but it tells you things that lectures don't. The subject of that particular audit, on a November afternoon in a graduate school library in Indianapolis, was John, son of Zebedee. I filled in the columns methodically. Matthew, 7 appearances. Mark, 11. Luke, 10. I was not surprised. John was one of the 3 disciples in Jesus' inner circle: the Transfiguration, Gethsemane, the request for seats at God's right hand. He was visible across the synoptic accounts the way major figures always are. Then I got to the Gospel of John. I ran the concordance. I read through chapter 1, chapter 3, chapter 5, chapters 10 through 21. I found the name John referring to John the Baptist. For John the Baptist. Not once for John, son of Zebedee. Not once in the entire gospel that bears his name. I checked again. I ran the concordance again. I read the Greek text directly, chapter by chapter, to make sure I wasn't missing something. John, son of Zebedee. 0. I closed the concordance. I wrote in the margin of my legal pad in small letters. The Gospel of John does not contain John. I sat with that for a long time. Then I turned back to chapter 11. Lazarus, the one you love, is sick. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. See how he loved him. And then I turned forward to chapter 13, verse 23. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. No name, no introduction, as if the reader is already expected to know who he is. I drew a line between the two passages. I sat there a lot longer than I had planned. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers matter. John, son of Zebedee, appears by name in Matthew 7 times. He appears in Mark 11 times. He appears in Luke 10 times. Across the 3 synoptic Gospels combined, he is named 28 times. He is one of the most present figures in the entire Gospel tradition. He is there at the Transfiguration, when Jesus' face shines like the sun. He is there in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night of the arrest. He and his brother James are named Sons of Thunder by Jesus himself. The mother of the sons of Zebedee goes to Jesus directly and asks for their seats at his right and left hand in the kingdom. He is everywhere. Now open the Gospel of John, the Gospel that bears his name, the Gospel the Church has attributed to him for nearly 2,000 years. The name John in the Gospel of John refers to John the Baptist. John chapter 1, verse 6, John chapter 1, verse 15, John chapter 3, verse 23, John chapter 5, verse 33, John chapter 10, verse 41. Every single occurrence of the name John in that Gospel, the Baptist. The fisherman who supposedly wrote it never appears by name inside it, not once. Not in any form. Think about that for a second. This is not a minor discrepancy. This is not a copying error or a translation problem. The Gospel of John is the only Gospel in the New Testament that never names its supposed author anywhere within it. The Church has built nearly 2,000 years of tradition on an author who, by the evidence of the text itself, is simply not there. And the question I could not stop asking, sitting in that library in Indianapolis with a concordance and a legal pad and a very cold cup of coffee, was this: if the Gospel of John was written by John, son of Zebedee, if he was the disciple reclining at Jesus' breast, standing at the foot of the cross, running to the empty tomb, then why did he never write his own name? Not once, not as witness, not as author, not as apostle, not even in the third person. The Gospel calls him only this: the disciple whom Jesus loved. And the church, for 19 centuries, told you his name was John. The gospel never agreed. You have heard the Gospel of John your entire life. You know how it opens. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You heard it at Christmas. You heard it at funerals. You heard it in every church you ever sat in every version of the same wooden pew. You know the wedding at Cana, the water turned to wine. You know the Samaritan woman at the well. You know I am the way and the truth and the life. You know I am the resurrection and the life. You know Lazarus, dead 4 days, coming out of the tomb still wrapped in burial cloth. You know the Last Supper, the beloved disciple reclining against Jesus' chest. You know Mary Magdalene in the garden at dawn, the risen Jesus saying her name. You knew who that beloved disciple was. You were told, John, the fisherman, the son of thunder, the youngest of the apostles, the one who outlived them all, who died of old age in Ephesus, who wrote his gospel last, looking back on a life spent at Jesus' side. That is what you were told. But here is what the gospel actually says. If you open it right now, any translation, any edition, and you search for John the Apostle, John son of Zebedee, John the disciple, you will find nothing. The gospel does not contain him. It contains only the disciple whom Jesus loved. And it never tells you who that is. You have spent your entire life reading the testimony of someone whose name was given to you by a church official writing 150 years after the events. The gospel itself never gave you that name. The gospel kept it hidden. And the question the church has never answered to the satisfaction of the actual text is why. Here is the moment when the trail has to be followed all the way back. The entire identification, John son of Zebedee as the beloved disciple, as the author of the gospel, traces to a single source. 1. His name was Irenaeus. He was the bishop of Lyon. He was writing around 180 of the Common Era. That is approximately 150 years after the crucifixion. He wrote in a work called Against Heresies. John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, himself also published a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. That sentence became the foundation of something the church has taught for nearly 2 millennia. Irenaeus never met John. He was not alive during John's lifetime. He was not in the 1st century. He was writing in the 2nd century, in Lyon, in what is now France, drawing on sources that were themselves decades removed from the events. Now here is the part that is not taught in church history class. Irenaeus was also the writer who looked at John chapter 8, verse 57, the verse where Jesus' opponents say, "You are not yet 50 years old," and concluded from that single line that Jesus had lived to be nearly 50 when he was crucified. Nearly 50. Modern scholars reject that reading without exception. The verse is a taunt, not a biographical record. There is no serious historian today who believes Jesus was crucified at nearly 50 years of age. But that is the same writer, the same bishop, writing in Lyon in 180, the same single source. And that is not the only problem with the chain of evidence. There is also a figure called Papias. He was a bishop writing around 130 of the Common Era. He is frequently cited as corroboration for the John in Ephesus tradition. But the church historian Eusebius, writing his ecclesiastical history in the 4th century, explicitly notes that Papias himself distinguished between 2 different figures named John. One was John the Apostle. The other was John the Elder, or John the Presbyter, a separate individual whom Papias describes as one of his own sources. Eusebius was troubled enough by this distinction that he raised the question directly. Was the John of Ephesus the apostle or the elder? He was not sure. The man who assembled Christian history in the 4th century was not sure which John was which. And the New Oxford Annotated Bible, one of the most widely used scholarly editions in the English-speaking world, in its 2018 edition, now states that the Gospel was more probably written by a disciple of John, son of Zebedee. Not by John, by a disciple of John. The retreat has begun, quietly, in footnotes, in scholarly editions that the congregation does not read. But it has begun. 150 years, one source, with documented errors. That is the entire foundation of the identification the Church has never questioned. So if the beloved disciple is not John, son of Zebedee, or at least not provably so from within the text, then who is he? The Gospel of John gives us a candidate, and the candidate is hiding in plain sight. In 1949, a biblical scholar named Floyd Filson published a paper in the Journal of Biblical Literature. The title was, "Who was the beloved disciple?" His conclusion? No other person who appears in the Gospel can be regarded as a serious rival for the honor. He was talking about Lazarus. The argument starts in chapter 11. Before the beloved disciple ever appears in the Gospel of John, one specific man is named as someone Jesus loved. Not one declaration, not two. 3. John chapter 11 verse 3. The sisters of Lazarus send word to Jesus. Lord, the one you love is sick. The Greek word is phileo, brotherly love, intimate love. John chapter 11 verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. The Greek word is agapao, the deepest form of love, the same verb the Gospel will use throughout for the beloved disciple. John chapter 11, verse 36. The crowd watching Jesus weep at Lazarus' tomb says, "See how he loved him." Teleo again. Both verbs, both forms of love, applied to one man, by name. And then in chapter 13, verse 23, someone appears at the Last Supper. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. No name, no introduction, no explanation of who this person is, as if the reader is already expected to know. Filson's argument was that the Gospel structured itself to introduce Lazarus as the beloved one in chapter 11, and then to present the beloved disciple in chapter 13 without a name, because the name had already been given. That is a textual argument, not a theological one. The vocabulary matches. The structure matches. The wordless entry demands an explanation. Ben Witherington III, a professor at Asbury Theological Seminary, is an evangelical scholar, not someone inclined toward unorthodox readings. He reviewed the Lazarus hypothesis directly. His assessment? Serious and worthy of consideration. That is not a dismissal. That is a serious scholar acknowledging that the case has real weight. And the weight does not stop at chapter 13. The beloved disciple is present at the crucifixion. He stands at the foot of the cross while the other disciples have fled. He runs to the empty tomb on Easter morning. He is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee at the final breakfast. Where would Lazarus be? Exactly there. At every scene that mattered most. Because he had already been through the thing the others could not yet comprehend. He had already died. He already knew what the inside of a tomb looked like. He already knew what it sounded like when someone called you back. But here is where the trail deepens. And this is the detail that stopped me cold. John chapter 21, verse 23. This is near the very end of the Gospel. The risen Jesus has appeared on the shore of the lake. He has spoken to Peter about his future. He has made an oblique comment about the beloved disciple. And then the author of the Gospel pauses and records something that wasn't planned. Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. A rumor circulating within early Christian communities. At the time the Gospel was written, the belief that the beloved disciple was somehow immortal, and the Gospel has to stop and address it directly. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, If I want him to remain alive until I come again, what is that to you? The author is correcting a widespread belief. The community thought the beloved disciple would never die. Now ask the question the text forces you to ask. Why would anyone believe that? People die. Everyone understood that. The disciples had watched their teacher executed on a cross. They had seen Stephen stoned. They knew martyrdom was a real possibility for all of them. They had no reason to think any specific disciple was exempt from death. Unless the person in question had already died once and come back. He who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of linen. John chapter 11, verse 44. Lazarus, the man who had already been in a tomb for 4 days. The man whose death was witnessed by a crowd. The man Jesus called out of a sealed tomb. If the early Christian community that produced and preserved this gospel understood the beloved disciple to be Lazarus, if they knew that the witness at the heart of their text was the man Jesus had already raised from death, then the rumor that he would not die is not random superstition. It is logic. He had already come back once. Why would the second death be any different? The Gospels need to address and correct this rumor in the final verses at the very end, suggests the rumor was not accidental. It was built on something the community understood about this person's identity, something that made immortality seem like a reasonable expectation. That detail is in the text. It has always been in the text. The church has read past it for 1900 years. Picture Lazarus standing at the tomb. Not his tomb, the other one, the empty one in the garden before the city has woken up, before the sun is fully over the hills outside Jerusalem. He has been here before. Not in this garden. In a different tomb. In Bethany. 3 days sealed in the dark. He knows what it smells like. The limestone cold. The weight of the linen wrapping his hands. The absolute silence that is unlike any silence you have ever heard while alive. And then the voice that pulled him out of it. Lazarus, come out. He knows that voice better than anyone standing in this garden right now. He knows it from the other side. And now he is standing at the entrance of another tomb. The stone rolled away. The burial cloths folded, set aside. The man he watched die 3 days ago. The man he followed to the cross. The man whose burial he witnessed is gone. Every other person who will come to this garden this morning will encounter this as something unprecedented. A thing that has never happened. A rupture in everything they know about how the world works. Not Lazarus. Lazarus stands at the entrance of that empty tomb and knows, not by faith, not by desperate hoping, but by direct personal experience, that this is not impossible. That the voice that called him through his own death is alive. That the thing Jesus had said would happen, happened. He is the only person in that garden who is not surprised. And the gospel says he was there, at the Last Supper, at the cross, at the tomb before dawn. The one Jesus loved, the one whose name the gospel chose never to write. I wrestled with this for years, I have to be honest with you. Because Lazarus is not the only theory, the identity of the beloved disciple has become, in New Testament scholarship, one of the more contested questions of the last several decades. And I think the honest thing to do is walk you through what else is on the table. In 1995, James Charlesworth of Princeton Theological Seminary published a full academic treatment of the question. The book is called The Beloved Disciple, whose witness validates the Gospel of John. His candidate was Thomas. His argument? Thomas is the one who demands physical proof of the resurrection. Thomas is the one whose encounter with the risen Jesus. Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side, produces the Gospel's highest Christological confession. My Lord and my God. Thomas is positioned climactically, absent for the first resurrection appearance, and then present for the definitive one. Charlesworth read this as the Gospel saving its most important witness for the end. The argument is interesting, but Thomas is named throughout the Gospel. 8 times, always by name. The beloved disciple is systematically unnamed, in scene after scene, where naming him would be easy. The anonymity is deliberate, and Thomas's deliberate naming works against the identification. Then there is Richard Bauckham. His 2006 book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, is one of the most rigorous works in contemporary New Testament scholarship. Bauckham argued that the beloved disciple was a real historical eyewitness. He is confident of that. But he rejected the identification with John, son of Zebedee, directly. He proposed instead a Jerusalem-based figure connected to the priestly establishment. That detail matters. John chapter 18, verse 15. On the night of the arrest, the beloved disciple follows Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. He gets in without being questioned. The other disciple was known to the high priest. A fisherman from Galilee would not walk into the high priest's courtyard unchallenged. Someone with priestly connections would. Lazarus of Bethany, a man from a village just outside Jerusalem, with sisters who clearly moved in elevated social circles, fits that profile better than any Galilean fisherman. Then there is the reading proposed by Sandra Schneiders at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, who has argued for Mary Magdalene. The argument rests on John chapter 20, Mary as the first witness to the resurrection, the first person the risen Jesus names, the one he addresses personally when she believes he is the gardener. Mary! She recognizes him by his voice. I find the textual evidence for Lazarus stronger than any of these. The 3 love declarations in chapter 11, using the same vocabulary, phileo and agapao, that the Gospel uses for the beloved disciple. The unnamed entry in chapter 13 that requires no introduction. The deathbed rumor in chapter 21 that makes logical sense only if this person had already come back from death once. But I want to be absolutely clear about something. Every serious scholar I have mentioned, Filson, Charlesworth, Bauckham, Schneiders, Witherington, agrees on one central point. The traditional church identification cannot be sustained from within the text. John, son of Zebedee, is not in the Gospel of John. That is no longer a fringe position. That is where the textual evidence has brought the scholarship. The debate is about who the beloved disciple actually is, not about whether the church's answer is adequate. It is not. So let me ask the question the church has never had to answer publicly, because the question was rarely asked loudly enough. If the beloved disciple was Lazarus, if the closest witness to the final days of Jesus, the figure whose testimony the Gospel of John explicitly claims to rest on, the man at the breast at the Last Supper, at the foot of the cross, at the empty tomb, if that man was someone Jesus had already raised from the dead, why did the church need him to be a fisherman? An investigator who has spent 4 decades circling the earliest documentary layers of the Christian tradition has framed this in a way I keep returning to. The church needed an apostle. Not a miracle? An apostle is manageable? You can trace an apostle's movements. You can assign him a diocese, a city, a theological mission. You can give him a martyrdom or a peaceful death in Ephesus. You can build a church on an apostle. You can build a hierarchy on an apostle. What do you do with the man Jesus had already raised from death? A man who had been to the other side and come back is not manageable in the way institutions require. He is not doctrinal. His authority does not trace through the apostolic succession. His knowledge of what Jesus meant by eternal life and resurrection is not secondhand. It is experiential. A church built on mediating the mystery of death and resurrection does not need a witness who has already resolved that mystery personally. That witness is a problem. His existence raises questions the institution is not structured to answer. The church needed John. John is safe. John is a fisherman from Galilee who was called by name and given a mission. John can be martyred or allowed to die in peace. John can be the founder of a community in Asia Minor. John is legible. Lazarus is not. Lazarus is the man the institutions cannot classify. The man who died and came back and then became the primary eyewitness to everything that followed, including another resurrection. What do you do with that testimony? You keep it. You cannot erase the Gospel of John. It is too central, too theologically rich, too embedded in the canon. You keep the testimony. You just remove the name of the person who gave it. Across decades of investigating the gap between the historical Jesus and the institution that claimed him, in Caballo de Troia and in everything that followed it, one principle emerges that I have come to find more credible the longer I have looked at the evidence. The church did not preserve at random. Every choice about what to keep and what to cut, what to name and what to leave unnamed. Those choices were not accidents. They were not careless oversights by scribes who didn't notice what they were doing. They were consistent with a particular institutional interest, the interest in a legible hierarchy, the interest in a church that could govern, that could demand loyalty, that could excommunicate and ordain and draw lines around who was inside and who was outside. The interest in making the message of Jesus into something that could be administered. And in the case of the beloved disciple, this principle finds one of its most consequential applications in the entire New Testament. They kept the testimony, they erased the witness. The Gospel of John exists. The testimony of the beloved disciple is preserved in it. Every scene at the Last Supper, every moment at the cross, every detail of the empty tomb, the folded cloth, the mourning on the shore, all of it is there. But the name of the person who witnessed those things was never written in, was systematically replaced by a pronoun, was left as an open question inside the text. The disciple whom Jesus loved. Testimony, preserved. Witness, erased. That is not careless editing. That is a decision. And Irenaeus in Lion, in 180, filled the blank with the name the institution required. John. Whether he knew the real name, or whether the real name had already been buried, or never written down to begin with, as a deliberate act of protective anonymity on the author's own part, the text cannot tell us. What the text can tell us is this: the real name was never John. The Gospel of John never said it was. The Gospel of John is the only one of the four that was never willing to. John chapter 11, verse 35. Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible. He is standing outside the tomb of the man he loves. Martha has told him he arrived 4 days too late. The crowd has gathered. Mary is weeping at his feet. And Jesus weeps. Not because he is helpless. He knows exactly what he is about to do. He weeps because the man is dead, because that is what death does to the ones who love. Because love is not exempt from grief, even when it holds the power to undo it. Then he calls him out. Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out, wrapped in linen, blinking in the light of an ordinary Bethany afternoon. The Gospel does not tell us what they said to each other afterward. It does not record what Lazarus experienced during the 4 days, or what he told Jesus in private, or how he made sense of what had happened to him. It tells us only that word spread, and that the religious authorities began to plan. What we know from the rest of the Gospel is that someone followed Jesus everywhere after that, to the home in Bethany where the expensive perfume was poured over Jesus' feet, to Jerusalem for the final week, to the room where the last meal was shared, to the garden where the arrest happened, into the courtyard of the high priest, to the foot of the cross on the hill outside the city, to the garden before dawn on the third day. Running. Someone was always there, always the closest, always unnamed. The disciple whom Jesus loved. You are reading the gospel of the man who came back from death. You always were. His testimony is in every scene. His witness is in every verse. The intimacy of the Gospel of John, its interiority, its mystical register, its difference from the other three, has a biographical explanation. It was written by someone who had already been somewhere the others hadn't. Someone for whom "I am the resurrection and the life" was not a theological proposition. It was a personal history. And the church spent 1,800 years telling you his name was someone else's. The gospel itself never agreed.